Welcome to the Myths of Ancient History series, in which we look at common misconceptions about the ancient past. I'm a historian and a teacher, and I give you the straight dope about what we know and how we know it. Most people have heard of Graham Hancock. He's probably the most famous propagator of alternative ancient history, proposing that there existed a lost advanced civilization tens of thousands of years ago. It's an idea that has gained a huge following among the public, but no following among the anthropologists, archaeologists, prehistorians, geologists, and geneticists who study this period. In many ways, Joe Rogan is the everyman. He represents the average person with the same kinds of feelings, thoughts, and biases that we all have. And so, don't think of this video as an attack on him. How he or he isn't persuaded of something isn't particularly unusual. Instead, view him as someone like yourself or one of your friends or family, because I will be using him to illustrate how his responses to what he hears could be the responses that any one of us might have. They are understandable reactions, and maybe by examining them, we can learn more about ourselves and arm ourselves so that we can build better critical thinking skills, and it will be more difficult to be taken in by the smooth talk of proselytizers. So this video is an attack against Graham Hancock then? No. This is an analysis of Graham Hancock's rhetorical strategies, not about his character. Graham seems like a very nice guy. I have no problem with him personally. I'm sure he'd be a pleasure to hang with. I generally give him the benefit of the doubt that he believes what he says. But whether he does or not, this isn't really relevant to whether other people can be swayed by what he says. The purpose of this educational video is to examine how ideas with honestly very little to recommend them can be so widely spread and can convince so many people. Now I realize some of you strongly believe his ideas have much to recommend them, that he has a great deal of evidence to back up his claims. If you know this series, you know that in other videos I look closely at the supposed evidence for the existence of a now lost civilization during the last ice age, and show how it doesn't hold up to scrutiny. Even in his recent debate with Flint Dibble, Hancock admitted that the archaeological evidence for a lost civilization is lacking. It's not the purpose of this video to examine that, though. In this video, we're going to look at the power of rhetoric. Specifically, we are looking at persuasion tactics that people like Graham Hancock use that have nothing to do with evidence, and how often these tactics help to fill in the gaps left in the record of evidence. So it's not really even just about Hancock. You can find these public relations strategies being employed by many purveyors of unusual ideas. Once you become cognizant of them, you will see them all over the place. And to be clear here, I'm not on a crusade to cancel Graham Hancock or anyone else who has alternative ideas. I think he should be free to express his opinions, and I think I should be free to express mine. This video is an expression of my free speech. And if you have any thoughtful criticisms of it, you're free to express them in the comments below. Because I will be sharing clips with you, some people might accuse me of taking Hancock's or Rogan's words out of context. But I went through every word of every episode to make sure I took context into account. And I will show on screen both the number of the episode and the timestamp so that you can check up on me to make sure. If you find that I did take something out of context, please let me know what you found, and if it checks out, I will admit my mistake. The first question I asked myself was, how many times did Graham Hancock have to appear on the Joe Rogan Experience before he started to pull Joe over to his side? And what I found was that Joe was a huge Hancock fan even before the first appearance.
Graham Hancock is probably the one guy who's influenced my view of history more than anybody ever. Fingerprints of the Gods I started reading sometime in the late 90s and just became engrossed in it and fascinated by this concept that civilization, and as you put it, that we are a species that has amnesia and that we just forgot what our past was.
I must say that your show has opened my work up to an audience that otherwise would never have seen it. And I'm grateful. I'm grateful.
Well, I'm grateful for you because your work has opened my mind to a completely new view of human beings and the history of human beings.
What exactly is it about the way Hancock presents his ideas that are so attractive? Yes, with the power of the pen, he can weave an absorbing story. But what does he put into that story? One method that Graham Hancock employs to lay the groundwork for what he has to say, and he does this in practically every presentation he makes, is to portray archaeologists in a negative light. He may feel this is necessary because archaeologists have not accepted his views, so he says that archaeology, the archaeological establishment, is protecting a preconceived narrative about the Earth's past. It does not allow new novel ideas to be put forward. It quashes any disagreement. But this is not merely a defense, an explanation for why the establishment does not agree with Hancock. He will often lead with this, before even presenting his own evidence. It's a way of poisoning the well, and has the effect of limiting the hearer's desire to ever go and check to see what archaeologists themselves actually are saying about a subject, because they can't be trusted.
I've come to view archaeology and history as a kind of more ideology, really, than science. There's an ideological view about how civilization developed, that we have this long, slow, gradual, politically correct rise from the Upper Paleolithic, from the hunter-gatherers through the Neolithic into the first cities, and we go on, and then we develop technologies, and here we are, the apex and the pinnacle of this whole story. And gosh, we're so proud of ourselves and our achievements, and we think we're wonderful, and we praise and value our technology. I've got nothing against technology, but there's a hint of arrogance in this. There's a hint of pride, that it was all about us. And I think that once you start introducing this new view of history, that there may have been an earlier civilization, a high civilization, which was utterly wiped out by a global cataclysm, why it contradicts that ideological position, and you find yourself in ideological struggle with archaeologists.
The arrogance of archaeologists and historians that Hancock describes, he says, is the result of their ideology. This is interesting. Their portrayal of the human story is prideful because it suggests that humans got better and better over time until they reached us, and we are the apex. The implication is that Hancock's view that civilizations rise and fall represents a more humble view of humanity. But surely he must know that history is not presented by archaeologists as a simple, gradual line of progress going up. It has plenty of ups and downs. You can read about the growth and decline of civilizations in most history books, even of catastrophic disasters. The Minoan eruption, the Bronze Age collapse, the fall of Western Rome, the Black Death, the plagues brought by Europeans that wiped out American civilization. Geneticists have found population collapses at various points in time. There are many hills and valleys in the line of progress in the mainstream view of human history. And surely no one has said that progress stops in our time. And if progress will continue after our time, we are not the pinnacle. At some point in the future, it might decline again. When I read history books, I don't see historians commenting about how much more awesome people are today than they were in the past. So I'm having a hard time seeing this particular form of arrogance that Hancock is talking about.
This is part of the problem I have with archaeology as a discipline. It likes to think of itself as scientific, but what I think it's primarily doing, and it is weird, is trying to control the narrative about the past.
Do you think that's because the people that are in control of archaeology, the academics, the professors, these people have written books on these things, have lectured on these things, and they've been very specific about timelines and dates?
Yeah, I think it's a complicated it's a complicated mixture of things. First of all, because archaeology is so desperate to be seen as a science, it tries as hard as possible to distance itself from any ideas that might be seen as woo-woo. You know, anything out on the edge, archaeology doesn't want to associate itself with. And then it takes the next step and really seeks to attack out on the edge ideas.
The implication here is that archaeologists cannot distinguish between actual woo and merely ideas that are out on the edge. But more significantly, that they judge an idea by the general feeling that it gives them, or by what it sorta kinda sounds like, rather than on what they usually judge matters by, which is the actual evidence.
Now, I don't know why the possibility of a lost civilization during the Ice Age should be an out-on-the-edge idea. We've had lost civilizations before. The Indus Valley civilization today in Pakistan wasn't known about until the 1920s. It was found by accident. And, every turn of the archaeologist's spade can reveal new information. But the reaction to my proposal that we've forgotten an episode in the human story, it's always been hostile since I published Fingerprints of the Gods in 1995. But with Ancient Apocalypse, much bigger platform reaching a much wider audience, the reaction was just hysterical. And it went on for a very long time. And it appeared to me, I don't think it's a conspiracy. I don't think archaeologists are involved in a conspiracy. I think the people who are attacking me genuinely believe in what they're saying, and they genuinely think I'm harmful.
He says he doesn't know why his idea should be out on the edge, despite the fact that this has been explained to him hundreds of times over 3 decades. He knows it is because history is based on evidence, and his evidence is lacking. It's not hard to understand, and yet he continues to tell Joe and others that he can't understand why, that it must be because of failings of the archaeological establishment. And so he relies on the credulity of the people he talks to. They think to themselves, Hancock must know, right? It's happening to him. And then he speaks of criticism as hostility or hysteria. It's important to his narrative that he be seen as a persecuted man. This is how he preps people so that when they do begin to hear archaeologists speaking about the errors Hancock has made, they will be more likely to turn the archaeologists off because they think it's just a bunch of nasty know-it-alls who don't like being contradicted. And what I have observed is that when Hancock's fans do see archaeologists talking, they will focus on their demeanor or tone, looking for signs of smugness or conceit, rather than on the content of their words.
The way archaeology works, there's going to continue to be huge resistance to new evidence. And that's really problematic because science should be open to new evidence and it should be willing to change its mind when new evidence suggests that a change of mind is needed.
If Mr. Hancock wants the archaeologists to change their mind, the evidence he presents must be sufficient to do so. Anyone that studies archaeology knows that archaeologists constantly, and since the beginning, have been saying that it is difficult to know what happened in the past. This is why they are very careful about jumping to conclusions and temper their words to be sure not to make more of a piece of evidence than is justified. Unlike historians and archaeologists, Graham does not temper his conclusions when evidence is absent. He fills in the gaps with whatever narrative he wants.
You see, that's why archaeologists need to be a little more humble, because the next turn of the spade can change everything, completely alter the story, and we should always remain.
Yeah, it's so ironic in a way that the human desire for knowledge is what has led us to where we are today. We have this insatiable desire for knowledge and for innovation, but that same human desire to achieve is also what's the ego's responsible for that. And the ego blocks anything that's contrary to what you've already established as fact.
History and archaeology are constantly being updated. You can observe their ideas change in real time. All you have to do is look. Compare a college history textbook from today with one from 10 years ago. The narrative of history has been revised. Subscribe to archaeological news outlets and see how new discoveries are changing the way archaeologists think all the time. Updates are occurring constantly. The irony here is that when Rogan says that ego blocks people from changing their ideas, he is aptly describing Hancock's approach, but he doesn't see it. He thinks he's describing the archaeological establishment.
I've spent decades searching for proof of this lost civilization at sites around the globe.
Note here, he does not say he is searching for the truth. He's not collecting evidence and then judging it to figure out what happened. He is searching for proof of this lost civilization. Ask yourself, when new evidence is presented to Graham Hancock, what will he do with it? Well, we know from his history what he usually does. What matters most is whether the piece of evidence supports his thesis about a lost civilization that existed during the last ice age and was wiped out in a cataclysm. If it seems to support his thesis, he will embrace it and publish about it. And if it contradicts his thesis, he he will most often dismiss it out of hand as invalid, or sweep it under the rug and pretend it doesn't exist. On this principle, he will even choose to favor a disputed theory over a consensus viewpoint. Hancock has built his whole brand around his narrative. He is not about to change it now. He may revise his opinion about minor points here and there when he has to, but not the basic thesis. Compare that to archaeologists who find a place like Göbekli Tepe and immediately update their understanding of what happened. If you read the headlines about new discoveries, you will often see archaeologists saying, "We used to think this, but because of this new evidence, now we think this." Does that sound resistant to new evidence? They do this because they as a group have not built a brand around the narrative. Their brand is that they are detectives trying to figure out what happened. The conclusion is irrelevant. The irony of all this is that Joe thinks that Graham is the open-minded one, the one making changes, and the archaeologists are not. It's the exact opposite of the truth. I agree that ego is a problem, but it's especially a problem for the lone individual against hundreds of experts around the world. And I'm not talking here about Hancock specifically. A person who thinks that they have found things everyone else missed. A person who thinks they see things more clearly than all the subject experts. A person whose pride is hurt when their ideas don't get accepted. They can't understand why anyone would not be convinced. So what do they conclude? If they have a modicum of humility, they will say, I must have missed something. If they have a huge ego, they say, there must be something wrong with the establishment because it certainly isn't me. I can't help but think of the words of physicist Richard Feynman in his famous cargo cult speech, when he says what anyone doing science ought to have. It's a kind of scientific integrity, he says, a principle of scientific thought that corresponds to a kind of utter honesty, a kind of leaning over backwards. For example, if you're doing an experiment, you should report everything that you think might make it invalid. Not only what you think is right about it, other causes that could possibly explain your results, and things you thought of that you've eliminated by some other experiment, and how they worked, to make sure the other fellow can tell they have been eliminated. Details that could throw doubt on your interpretation must be given, if you know them. You must do the best you can, if you know anything at all wrong, or possibly wrong, to explain it. If you make a theory, for example, and advertise it or put it out, then you must also put down all the facts that disagree with it, as well as those that agree with it. There is also a more subtle problem. When you have put a lot of ideas together to make an elaborate theory, you want to make sure, when explaining what it fits, that those things it fits are not just the things that gave you the idea for the theory, but that the finished theory makes something else come out right, in addition. In summary, the idea is to try to give all of the information to help others to judge the value of your contribution, not just the information that leads to judgment in one particular direction or another. Does Graham Hancock lean over backward to falsify his thesis if possible?
See today's specials at rusnackvolvocarswestlake.com/specials.
New churches, real rewards. Sign up and get free chicken. For real.
There is a double-sided component to Hancock's presentation of himself. On the one hand, he's just asking questions and suggesting other ways of looking at things, but is not actually saying that he's right.
I don't claim to be an archaeologist or a scientist. I am a journalist. I feel my role is to inquire into interesting things that are forbidden territory for scientists. And when I inquire into them, it doesn't mean that I'm insisting this is a fact. What I'm saying is this is something that we need an alternative point of view on, and let's look at and consider what this might mean. And I may be completely wrong, but I think the exploration is worthwhile. That's the position that I take.
On the other hand, he's a crusader, waging war against the establishment and the purveyor of a superior model of history.
I'm trying to overthrow the paradigm of history.
These two versions of Hancock come out at different times, depending on which attitude is needed for a given response. Are they contradictory positions? Some might call this a Motte and Bailey. I mean, it is possible to suggest an alternative point of view and attempt to overthrow the paradigm of history, but he can't say he's only suggesting an alternative point of view. And how can he acknowledge he may be completely wrong, but also say that he knows the paradigm of history is wrong for contradicting his point of view? I don't know.
In a way, I've been glad to have received vituperative level of attack from archaeology that I did, because it shows I've pressed their buttons.
When archaeologists ignore Hancock, he complains that they aren't giving his ideas due attention. When they give his ideas attention and naturally point out the errors, he complains that he's being persecuted. But don't be fooled. The negative attention is great for his brand because he can use it to his advantage, and does. He himself says he's glad, in a way, that it happened.
It shows there's something they feel they need to cancel here. There's something they feel they need to get rid of.
It's the most dangerous show on television.
The most dangerous show on Netflix. An absurd idea. Really crazy. But that's cancel language, you know. That's the language you use. Also, you call somebody anti-Semitic or racist or white supremacist or misogynist. All of those are easy labels, which these days just need to be applied to a person. Nobody even investigates or goes to see.
When the Society of American Archaeologists wrote to Netflix asking them to recategorize his special as science fiction, he can accuse them of trying to suppress his work. When they say that his ideas have racist or anti-Semitic origins, he can say, they're slandering me by calling me a racist. All of this feeds into his narrative about the man being out to get him. So it's all good for his brand. What the SAA wrote, even if it's true, looks to many people like a cheap shot, and it gains Hancock's sympathy. So I think it helps him more than harms him. I know he hates the criticism, but there's a side of him that loves it too. It's popular today to complain of cancel culture, and he can present himself as a victim of it, even though he has a larger platform than probably any living archaeologist in the world.
Well, it seems like to me, as a layperson, with all this evidence and all this evidence that correlates, it's all corresponding, it all seems to fit together, it would seem that this would be something that a lot of mainstream scientists and archaeologists would be extremely interested in. Like, why would they try to ignore something like this?
The first thing they've tried to do is to get rid of it. This is often the case where new information emerges that contradicts established theories. And it's a strange phenomenon in science, because we like to think of scientists as rational and reasonable people. But the fact is that when you get very committed to a particular model, to a particular idea, I think you start to connect your own personality to it. And any attack on that idea becomes an existential attack on you yourself.
How sad.
I have to ask, is Hancock committed to a particular idea? He seems to be. Has he connected this idea to his own personality, so that if it's attacked, he considers it an existential attack on himself? From what I've seen, this also is true. So right off the bat, this sounds hypocritical. But the other thing is, in the fields of history and archaeology, and science, criticism is not only encouraged, but required. When someone puts an idea out there, they expect and hope for their peers to find fault with it. Iron sharpens iron, after all. I do think it's true that some individuals, even in academia, have the tendency to consider attacks against their ideas as personal attacks. But everyone knows and expects that criticism will happen. And because they want their theories to withstand scrutiny, they are motivated to strengthen their arguments. Peer review is part and parcel of these fields. It helps to mitigate bias. Hancock is not interested in his ideas going through this process. If Hancock truly were interested in putting his ideas to the test, he would prepare his best arguments and publish them in a peer-reviewed academic journal, maybe with a co-author. But he prefers to bypass that process and go directly to the public, whom he knows has very little knowledge of ancient history, and to build his reputation on their support. And when archaeologists do critique his arguments, he bristles. Now, I understand that he's only a journalist, but when you say that your theories have more to recommend them than the theories of archaeologists, you are voluntarily entering the fray.
And it is because again and again what we see is the new facts being dismissed because they don't fit the existing theory, where in fact what we should be doing is modifying the existing theory to explain the newly discovered facts. And this is a problem in the whole history of science.
Is he saying that in science they don't modify existing theories to explain newly discovered facts? Surely you must know the history of science better than that. In fact, elsewhere he suggests that science is untrustworthy because its past ideas have been revised. As for archaeologists and historians, they're always suggesting new ways of looking at something. You can't get published unless you have something new to say. All you have to do is pick up some academic journals and read the papers. It's everywhere and plain to see. I mean, think about it. Why would anyone want to become an archaeologist? To just repeat what they have always been saying? Be serious. This is a field about discovery. So, how did Joe get the impression that archaeologists won't entertain new ideas? He got this impression from Graham himself. And when Joe says to Graham, it's a shame archaeologists won't listen to other ideas, Graham does not correct him. Instead, he encourages and continues to cultivate this mindset.
There's a climate of fear in archaeology. I don't mean to pick particularly on archaeologists here. I think this is generally true across other disciplines as well. These days, academics are driven by the need to publish research papers. That's what they build their careers on. If they can get a paper on their bit of research published in Nature or the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, etc., that's good for their careers. But then you confront the gatekeepers in those publications who regard any archaeological idea that is not part of the mainstream accepted consensus with great suspicion and are most reluctant to publish that information.
Hancock makes a good point. I think it is true that people can get set in their ways and should be more open to ideas that come from outside the box. But Hancock is using this as an excuse why his idea about a lost advanced civilization hasn't gotten through the gatekeepers. It's because of a climate of fear. But consider the possibility that the idea has not been accepted because the idea contradicts the preponderance of evidence. It's a possibility, isn't it? Hancock may not want to accept this possibility. Maybe you can.
If you go against the mainstream view, your career does not progress as an Egyptologist.
For context, he said this in regard to his son, who had been studying Egyptology, getting his grade marked down when he suggested in a paper that his father might be correct. But notice, he did not conclude, if you propose that the pyramids might be thousands of years older, your career does not progress. No, he says, if you go against the mainstream view. So, it sounds as if you can't disagree with the mainstream view about anything. And yet, archaeology is largely about disagreeing with prevailing views. Go read some archaeology papers.
I think that professional academia, particularly in the realm of archaeology, encourages those who are working in the field to think in terms of the existing paradigm, not to think in terms of challenging the paradigm, because it's dangerous. If you challenge the paradigm, you're going to be ridiculed by your colleagues and regarded as completely lunatic and attacked and insulted. So it's better not to challenge the paradigm.
When Hancock says paradigm, I think he's just referring to long-held beliefs which are assumed to be factual. And if so, it is true that challenging such notions will get a lot of pushback, though many have successfully done so and made it through relatively unscathed. But yes, entrenched ideas are harder to deconstruct. I don't think anyone would disagree. The point I want to make is that Hancock is using this to make it seem like his ideas are ridiculed primarily for this reason. But we have to understand, Joe has to understand, that just because certain beliefs are difficult to topple, this does not automatically mean that this is the reason why Graham Hancock's ideas are not accepted. As a viewer, I encourage you to consider the possibility that maybe Hancock thinks his ideas have more merit than they actually do.
But what a fascinating area of research to not challenge the paradigm, an area where you have so little information about what could have possibly happened. When you get back to 5,000 years ago, 6,000 years ago, 7,000 years ago, and you're trying to piece these puzzles together, to pretend that you have the entire timeline, it seems a little silly.
It's pretty crazy. This is the thing with history, where you have written documents that you can draw on, where you have those written documents, you can be reasonably certain about what's going on. further back we go, we don't have written documents. Beyond 5,000 years, we have no written documents. And to draw fixed and firm conclusions about what happened before 5,000 years ago on the basis of a few things dug out of the ground is not good enough. It's a mistake that's being made, and that, I believe, is going to change. It's going to be painful. It's going to be slow. It was painful to change the Ptolemaic system to the Copernican system, but it will happen. The system will change.
There are other kinds of documents besides written documents. All material remains are documents of a kind, and those are the kinds of documents archaeologists, anthropologists, and geologists study. But notice here how confident that Hancock is that there is going to be a paradigm shift, similar in some way to the change from the Ptolemaic system to the Copernican system. From what I can gather, the paradigm shift he is referring to is specifically one that takes into account the existence of his lost civilization. So I guess that would make him Copernicus.
This is how paradigms shift. I mean, everybody's familiar with the concept of a paradigm shift, and there's a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn, which outlines what a paradigm shift is, where an established model in some discipline of science that has been in control of people's thinking for a very long time suddenly falls apart. And it doesn't fall apart suddenly. What happens is that there's an accumulation of evidence which that model cannot explain. That paradigm cannot explain it. It seemed like a great paradigm at one point, but then it doesn't explain this. And then it doesn't explain that.
Thomas Kuhn's book has had considerable effect on popular culture, and Hancock is feeding off of it. In his book, Kuhn says that most scientific activity takes place within paradigms, and these paradigms define what questions are studied, what criteria are used to answer these questions, and what experiments are considered acceptable when making evaluations. However, from time to time, revolutions occur. These are periods when the paradigm changes. Examples of revolutions might be when Galileo and Copernicus overthrew the paradigm set by Aristotle, or when Einstein overthrew the paradigm set by Newton. They don't happen often. When Hancock is talking about overthrowing the paradigm, he is simply talking about a certain model that archaeologists, anthropologists, and historians, and geologists, and geneticists have about the development of human civilization. It's not really about redefining archaeology.
Like the paradigm that says that megalithic architecture is only 6,000 years old and that the first megalithic architecture was in Malta, that can't explain the massive megalithic site of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey 5,500 years before that. It's evidence like that, the slow accumulation of evidence that the existing system cannot explain, that at an eventual point, no matter how strongly the advocates of the existing system hold on to it, no matter how determined they are in their defense, no matter what dirty tricks they may choose to deploy to undermine their opponents, sooner or later the evidence overwhelms them and the paradigm goes down and you have a new way of thinking.
He says there was a paradigm that said that megalithic architecture is only 6,000 years old. There was never a paradigm that said that. All that was said was that our earliest known megalithic architecture is from that time. There was no statement that it could not possibly be older. It was simply a statement about the extent of our knowledge at the time.
Have you had any archaeologists review any of this work and change their opinions?
No.
No.
I haven't. But what I have found, and I found it interestingly during the research trips for America before, is a younger generation of archaeologists who are in the field. And they are quite different from the older generation of archaeologists who were running the whole scene 25 years ago. Now we have a very different younger generation, a younger generation that has been exposed to open-minded thinking, that has been exposed to the internet, that itself, as part of the general pattern of the younger generation, is suspicious of authority.
The reason why Hancock has not been able to get any archaeologists to change their opinions is because the evidence he has presented is insufficient to have any effect. I do agree, however, that the slow accumulation of evidence can overturn entrenched ideas over time. But in this case, that hasn't even come close to happening.
Get so puzzled and baffled by the resistance to it because it's just interesting.
Well, if it's right, it pulls the rug out completely from under the feet of archaeology, and that's why there's resistance to it. All human beings are territorial in their own way, and archaeologists are no exception. They're territorial. They've defined their territory. They see a gradual, slow, steady evolution of human society, and they think that we were at a relatively simple stage during the so-called Stone Age, and we just gradually got more and more sophisticated. And it's an appealing idea, and it makes sense in lots of ways, but there isn't room in that for an earlier civilization to have emerged and been destroyed. And that's why the idea is attacked, because if that idea were true, then the foundations on which archaeology has built the House of History would collapse.
Two observations about this. First, the idea that archaeologists are territorial. Academics have been working hard to make all of their research open source so that everyone can have access to it. It's not the academics who make it hard for people to find the research, it's the publishing companies. And amateurs help archaeologists all the time. Amateurs have even made great discoveries. Amateurs have proposed ideas that archaeologists have followed up on. Archaeologists interact with the public online, and members of the public feed them ideas. The intellectual value of Hancock's words are determined by the content, not by who is speaking them, much less by his diploma. People don't seem to realize this, but you don't need to have a higher degree to get your ideas published in a peer-reviewed academic journal. Your credentials aren't the deciding factor. What makes a paper get accepted into a journal is its level of scholarship. If you follow proper scholarly and scientific methods, and your conclusions are empirically drawn, you can get published. You don't have to belong to a group of elites. Graham Hancock himself could have taken this avenue, but this would require that he dot all his I's and cross all his T's, and he doesn't want to do that. He keeps saying that he's just proposing possibilities, but these proposals include telling people that archaeologists are wrong, and that he is leading the charge to overthrow their House of History. Now let's talk about that. Would the foundations on which archaeology has built the House of History collapse if a lost advanced civilization were found? Lost civilizations have been found before. They continue to be found. And what happens? They get added to the timeline of history. Archaeologists uncovered Göbekli Tepe. They added it to the timeline. If a civilization was found earlier, it too would get added to the timeline. So, what foundation is he talking about? The foundation that he described earlier, that there was a slow, gradual rise of progress? There is no such foundation. The reason why the timeline looks as it currently does, and this can't be emphasized enough, is because you lay out all of the things that have been found, placing them in the timeline according to scientific dating methods, not according to where you want to put them. And when you see them all laid out like that, that's what the timeline looks like. So if you find something new, you scientifically date it, and then you just add it. That's it. Now, to be fair to Graham Hancock, I should point out that he does, on occasion, on rare occasion, temper his words against archaeologists somewhat by giving them some credit. This doesn't happen that often, but he made a point to say this, and I should include this to be fair to him.
I'd like to say on the record, I don't hate archaeologists. I know that there's a lot of great work that's done by archaeologists. I myself could not do the work I do were it not for the work that archaeologists have done out there in the field, painstakingly digging and producing evidence. I have huge respect for archaeologists. I think there's a very limited group within archaeology who have this domineer mentality and who seek to control the narrative. But by and large, archaeology is doing a good and a useful thing. And I don't want... It's unfortunate that I've been identified as a hate figure by a number of archaeologists. I think there's much more potential for cooperation.
After hearing what he has said about archaeologists in various interviews, do you think the belief that he is a hate figure comes out of left field? I can understand why someone would think that about him. Also, do you notice how here he is saying that it is a limited group within archaeology that have this domineering mentality he has been talking about? And yet before, he painted archaeology with a very broad brush, saying archaeologists are this way. All this time he hasn't been saying some archaeologists. So when people hear him make these accusations, if they don't catch this rare caveat, they would never get the impression that he doesn't mean archaeologists in general, or archaeology as a field. And if only a limited group of archaeologists have this bad attitude, how are they able to control all the other archaeologists? Archaeology is a very decentralized discipline. There's no Pope of archaeology. There isn't an archaeological college of cardinals. Archaeologists are largely independent and have great academic freedom. They come from every corner of the world, from various ethnicities, countries, religions, political persuasions. So where is this limited group operating from? What are their names? How are they making dictates from on high?
A lot of archaeologists have accused me of accusing them of a conspiracy against me and trying to suppress
Well, they're just trying to
my...
make you look like a kook.
Yeah, I don't see any conspiracy. I see people who do believe what they're saying and who think I'm wrong, but who feel that I'm such a threat to the narrative that they present that I must be neutralized in any way possible. And that's a sad state of affairs. Science should embrace and explore new and different ideas, and particularly when it comes to the human past.
So he makes a point to say that he does not believe in a grand conspiracy in archaeology. The sins of archaeologists are simply the result of common biases intrinsic to humans. Okay, that seems fairly reasonable. But at other times, and this is another two-sided aspect of Hancock, he makes it sound like there is a conspiracy.
It certainly led me to conclude that academic history is part of a. This sounds a bit paranoid, but part of an overall system of kind of mind control that operates. There are certain things that we're allowed to think, and certain parameters that we're allowed to think within in our society. And when it comes to the past, those parameters are set by academics, and they get so territorial and so defensive when you try to break out of that.
Something else, although this sounds a bit conspiratorial, I think the existing view of history is part of a mind control system in our society. It's something that we're presented with, that we take in with our mother's milk, and we're never supposed to question. I think it's, if you control the past, you do actually control the present and the future as well.
So, but you mean if you have an absolutely established narrative that you're teaching and you're unwilling to look at any possible variations to that, you're saying, like, almost from an authority position, we know what happened and we know where we're going.
Yeah.
But if you say, shit, we don't know what happened, then it's, well, then who are you to tell us where we're going?
Exactly. And it starts to raise questions over everything, actually.
Right.
That last sentence is interesting. Hancock assumes it is true that the teachers of academic history are authority figures who are trying to control people's minds. And then he builds on that foundation, saying, hey, if they're lying to us, who else is lying to us? Shouldn't we establish the truth of the first claim before jumping to further conclusions?
If I get in an aeroplane, I do want the pilot to be a properly qualified pilot. I want him to have undergone all the training and to be really good at what he does. But flying an airplane and studying the human past are two different things. And archaeologists often compare themselves to airline pilots. They say, you wouldn't get in an airplane without a properly trained pilot, so why are you studying the past without a properly trained archaeologist? And what I say is, you've got blinkers on. You've got a very narrow perspective of what the past could be, and you're defending and protecting that perspective, and imposing a narrative about the past on the public. And that's where we get into a kind of religious aspect, that they become the high priests of the past.
Here he claims archaeologists are more like high priests than airline pilots. First of all, if you think that conducting an archaeological excavation requires no knowledge of training, you better think again. But I expect that Hancock is not talking about the actual archaeological work. That he's willing to let the archaeologist do. He's probably talking about the interpretation of the archaeological evidence. To me, I see this as akin to knowing how to read the instruments in the cockpit, because reading archaeological data isn't the easiest thing in the world. But sure, an amateur can figure it out if they study the subject, and yes, they can interpret the data. When problems arise is when an amateur doesn't study all the data or cherry picks his data to come up with the conclusions that he wants. I don't need a high priest of archaeology to tell me that.
I think that all three of the world's monotheistic faiths, whether it's Christianity, Judaism, or Islam, have been responsible for just a vast amount of misery in the world. And I think we're not going to move on as a human race unless we actually move on from that time, where we don't accept that something is true just because our parents or some guy with a beard tells us that it's true, where we look for direct experience of the spirit and the divine. This is the problem with all of those big religions. I don't care whether they call themselves Christians, Muslims or Jews, is that they're hierarchies, they're bureaucracies, they're power structures, and they do not offer a direct experience of it. That's why most of them persecute the use of psychedelics. They don't want direct contact with the divine.
The implication here is that archaeology or academic history is like religion, and that its purveyors are like priests. It's not accidental. He wants his audience to view academics in the same manner. But it is a construct that he has been creating. The way that archaeology is organized has no resemblance to religious institutions. But he wants Joe and his audience to think of it that way, because by taking away their legitimacy, he builds his own legitimacy.
Even though, huge negative forces are still at work and are still sitting in the seat of power, I think there's a tremendous hope for the future in America, and that comes from the awakening to consciousness of the American people. And maybe it's small right now, but it's growing. And in that sense, far more than any other, I believe America is leading the world. That there is this possibility for awakening here, and maybe it goes back to the founding fathers and the frontier days, and just the sense that people should be able to make decisions about their own lives without government telling them what to do. That's the step we all need to take. We need to move ahead. We need to set aside our commitment to these large monolithic religions. We need to set aside our commitment to large monolithic states. We need to run our own lives and make decisions for ourselves. And it just happens that is very close to the heart of what America is all about. So if we're going to wake up, we have to overthrow these systems of mental control which are in place.
It sounds almost like it is our patriotic duty to reject what archaeologists tell us.
Introducing Del Taco's Mucho Meals. More food and more flavor, starting at just $4.49.
One tight spot, and 2 competitive brothers, and up to 14 available camera views, including rear and side, and the Silverado family of trucks, and Chevrolet. Together, let's drive.
Information which used to be strictly controlled and in the hands of elites is now changing. The power structure of information is changing entirely, and that's potentially a very exciting new time to live in, and great things are coming out of it. And it's easy to say this, but I think a new consciousness is dawning in the world. Actually, I don't think it's very big yet. I think the old way of doing things is still extremely strong, but people are waking up to their power and saying, I am not simply to be pushed around and told what to do by an expert or a government official or a corporation.
With this narrative, even without having to discuss any of the evidence, he has already made a certain type of person, that is, the kind of person who despises the establishment, the man, put themselves firmly on his side. You gotta support the underdog, right? With this kind of foundation, it will take Hancock far less effort to convince. And don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that all someone has to do is tell Joe Rogan that they're anti-establishment, he'll believe everything they say. No. I mean only that the more someone can sympathize with a person, and the more they can identify with that person, and the more they have in common, the more they will be inclined to view things from that person's perspective. It's only human nature. And that's half the battle right there. Granted, I have met some people who take the anti-establishment side in everything automatically. Their identity is tied up in being anti-establishment. They say, I'm the anti-establishment guy. I'm Mr. Independent. It's who I am. If I agree with the mainstream, I'll look like a dork. I want to be cool. But I don't think Joe is that two-dimensional.
And the other thing that's changed a lot is the attitude of the man in the street to authority. That has changed. Back in the 90s, authority figures were the gatekeepers. They controlled everything. If an authority figure in a discipline like archaeology said, Hancock is completely wrong, he's made all this stuff up, that would generally be believed, not by everybody, but by the majority of people. today, to have a mainstream authority figure say that to me is actually an advantage, because people are so distrustful of authority, and rightly so, because we've been lied to by authority figures in all fields for so long. The bullshit has been so enormous that people are finally waking up, and we can't trust what authority figures say.
The implication of Hancock's words is that he is part of this counterculture revolution. And if you believe in this revolution, you ought to hop on board with his theories. It doesn't matter what the theories actually are. What matters is that you are not letting other people tell you what to believe. But aren't you?
This is one of the reasons why my work has not been cancelled, hasn't disappeared, because archaeology dislikes it, because the general public today distrust experts, and with good reason. There's a good reason to distrust experts. We've been told so many lies by experts over such a long period of time. They so often are confident, absolutely certain that they're right, and they turn out later to be wrong. That any intelligent person begins to wonder, are these experts really the only people we should listen to? And anyway, I want to think for myself. I don't want to be told what to think by a group of authority figures called archaeologists. I want a diverse range of information, and then I will draw my conclusions from it. I'm not speaking of me, I'm speaking of the general public. And I think that attitude is growing, but at the same time, there still is a slavish adherence to the words of experts.
What makes someone an expert? Knowledge and experience. The more your knowledge grows, and the more you gain experience in a subject, the greater your expertise. If you continue to study a subject in a comprehensive way, you're bound to become an expert. And then, when you do, according to Hancock, you should be trusted less. The more you know, the less trustworthy you are. Apparently, the people you should listen to are the people with only a rudimentary or intermediate understanding of the subject. And why? Because their minds are more open. Consider why experts' minds seem less open to alternatives. It's because the more data that you have, the fewer explanations there are to explain the data. So, for example, if the police are trying to figure out who the killer was, as they gather evidence, the number of suspects by process of elimination gets reduced, and hopefully they can narrow it down to one. But before they go through the process of collecting the clues, the number of suspects is numerous. It's the same here. The less you study a subject, the more possible explanations you can imagine. But the more you study a subject, the number of explanations for what happened gets reduced. That is why it seems to the outsider that experts' minds are more closed. In his efforts to call into question the reliability of archaeology, Hancock also continually misrepresents it, saying things about it that are either framed in a misleading manner or completely fabricated. He has stated before that he has never knowingly made false claims or deliberately spread